Hi there everybody, Pastor Zach here. Thanks so much for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about what is the Bible. That is pretty important. If you are going to study the Bible, you should probably know what it is, right? The Catholic Bible does have some additional books, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. They're called the Apocrypha. But the Catholic Bible and the Protestant, which is just non-Catholic Bible, share the same books outside of the Apocrypha, okay? So that's relatively the same. There's a couple, besides that, there's a couple of cults that add different books or take different, but for the most part, that's what everybody assumes, and so we're going to break it down by the sections. The Protestant Bible is broken up into two separate sections. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament, okay? Now, if you're looking at the two of those together, you're looking at about 66 different books that are written by approximately 40 different authors. Okay, and those books are written over the course of about 1,500 years. That's a couple two tree. And so the Old Testament, which is the first half, which follows the Jewish Bible, that's the Jewish Bible, is the Old Testament, is the first 38 books of the Bible. And it starts with the creation of the world and ends about 400 years before Jesus was born, give or take. These are sacred. These are the sacred writings that are the foundations of the Jewish people. And so when we talk about Judaism, this is going to be really important because we're going to talk about this quite a bit when we're talking about the Bible and we're talking about how to study, because a lot of the Bible is written to the Jewish people. And you might be confused because you're saying, Zach, you're a Christian. It looks like the first half of this book is all written to the Jewish people, and they're still walking around. Well, modern day Judaism is a little bit different from what was Judaism when the Old Testament was being written before Jesus. Basically, God comes, He creates people, and people have this, over time, as they're going through the Old Testament, they have this tumultuous relationship with God, where they are with Him, and then they're not with Him, and then they're with Him, and then they're not with Him, and they're all over the place. Now, because there's this back and forth, God calls His own people. And He says, I'm going to create a people that are going to be my representatives in the world. They're going to show everybody who I am. That was the Jewish people, right? And so as time progresses on, as we start reading the Bible, the one thing that you're going to see that's going to be a reoccurring theme, and spoiler alert, we're jumping ahead to the New Testament a little bit, Jesus is the focal point of the entire Bible. The focal point of the entire Bible. You have the Old Testament looks forward to His coming, the day when the Messiah would come and He would deliver His people, is constantly looked forward to in the Old Testament, and then the New Testament celebrates His coming. Now, God's people are always looking for the day that God's going to come and He's going to provide this final deliverance. And that is the Messiah. It's Jesus. Jesus is the one who's going to come, who's going to save everything. And you start looking at what the Old Testament has to say about this Savior, and He's born of a virgin, He's born in Bethlehem, He is killed, but none of His bones are broken. After a while, he's beaten, He's mocked. You start looking at all these different things, and you start looking at Jesus, and this is not a video on that topic, so we're not going to get too far into it. But you start looking at those things, you're like, wow, that's nobody else. I mean, we've had Jesus, and that's it. Nobody else. And so the Jewish people today, in theory, are still waiting for that Savior. They don't believe it was Jesus. And so when we talk about Judaism, and we talk about the Old Testament, that's what we mean. We mean essentially God's people before Christianity, because what happened was when Jesus came and He died and He rose from death, during His life He was calling all of the Jewish people to embrace Him as God. And so as He called them to embrace him. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And so that is the difference between what was and what currently is Judaism. And so when we look at the Old Testament, this was a book that was written for God's people. This was written for the Old Testament Jews before Jesus came. And it's still very practical for us today. Let's take a quick look at some of the books and some of the flow of the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are Genesis through Deuteronomy. They're called the Pentateuch. It basically just means a 5-volume book. And these were books that were written by Moses to people who were really struggling with who God was, who were really struggling with their faith. And so he lays out for them and for the future generations that are coming up what God has done. And he starts out with this beautiful picture of the world being created. And he tells the stories of faith that people have had before and how people have fallen and they've struggled, but God has still been there with them. And this is exactly what the people need in that time. And there's a lot that we can learn from that today. Now you continue on. The next 10 books, Joshua through Job, are historical in nature, and they tell more about the story of the Jewish people and how they're being raised up. Next is the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is a book about worship. It contains stories and songs that existed as an example of worship. Although there's poetry sprinkled throughout the entire Old Testament, this is really considered the poetic book, the book of poetry. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are the next ones up, and those are called the wisdom literature. And basically, each of those books takes a different approach of trying to teach wisdom to the person who believes in God. They're very, very practical books. The last 17 books, Isaiah through Malachi, are the prophets. There's some minor prophets and some major prophets, and basically, this is the story of God coming and talking to people that were set aside to share God's good news with his people, to speak to them on God's behalf. Now, because we're Christians, on the other side of Jesus dying, our mediator is God, or our mediator is Jesus. And so when you want to talk to God, you can go right to Jesus. You can talk to God right through Jesus. They couldn't necessarily do that then. And so the prophets were people that would mediate on behalf of God to his people and from the people onto God. And so that gives you a little bit of an overview just of the books, how the books in the Old Testament are laid out. Now, they are not laid out in chronological order. That's going to drive some of you crazy. They're not. They're laid out in order based on the type of literature that there is. As you saw, I broke it up into a couple different groups, and I said the first 4 books, the next series of books, the next series of books, the next series of books, because they go based on the type of literature. So you're going to see some carryover in the timing. If you would like to read the Old Testament in chronological order, they do make chronological Bibles. In fact, I'm going to link to one in here so you can actually go over to Amazon and pick one up if you want to check it out, or you can search them online. It's called a chronological Bible. Basically, it's the best attempt that we have to try to put all of those stories and the words, and sometimes it breaks up chapters and stuff just to insert stuff in the right order so that you can have the best chronological idea of what happened if you want to go back and take a look at it from that approach. Now, the New Testament picks up about 400 years later. It's meant to tell the story of Jesus and how his birth, death, and resurrection impact every aspect of our lives. And so Jesus is poised in the New Testament to be the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He says that over and over and over again. He constantly claims to be God. He constantly says, I'm here to fulfill what has been said. In fact, that's why the old order of Jews got so upset. That's why they charged him with blasphemy, was because he claimed to be God. Well, if you claim to be God and you're not God, That's blasphemy. So the people that didn't believe him charged him with that. The people who did became Christians. And so as we go through the New Testament, we see the order of the books. The first 4 books are called Gospels, and they're 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus. Okay, now these 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus, they're not like chapters of a book. They're actually the same story told 4 different ways. Now, to us, that's a little weird. That's a little weird. Why would you tell the same story 4 different ways? Well, 3 of those are called synoptic gospels, basically meaning that the content is almost identical in those first 3. It's just the actual facts of what happened, the stories of what happened in Jesus' life. If you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are going to be very similar. Now, there's going to be some small differences, but the main difference is going to be on how the story is told. And so, if you look at Matthew, Matthew was actually written to be an argument to Jews, people who were Jews that saw Jesus crucified, and the argument is, look, Jesus is the promised Messiah. So if you have questions about that, about how do we know Jesus is the promised Messiah, you want to read Matthew, because Matthew is going to go through that. Now, Matthew does assume that you understand a lot about Jewish culture. Mark does not. Mark was written to Gentiles. Gentiles are basically people that weren't Jewish. And so it was written to people who didn't have the history, that didn't understand. And so Mark was actually written to help explain to people who were not Jewish where Jesus came from, some of the Jewish traditions that they needed to understand the story of Jesus. And so when we look at Luke, Luke is actually an account. Luke was hired to write the story of Jesus. Luke gets this charge from this person or this group of people we don't really know, called Theophilus. Theophilus could be a person, it could be a title of a group of people that asked him to basically go and investigate. Did this really happen? Luke was a medical doctor, so Luke went and he investigated claims. He looked at the stories and told what happened. Now, the final gospel is John, and John was written by the disciple of the same name. It was written much later. It was written towards the end of John's life. John would have already he would already know that the other gospels are out there. Now, this is not a synoptic gospel. A lot of the content is new. And so John knows what's already been written down. And what he's doing is he's sharing more of the story. And he steps back and he writes this very short, relatively to the other books. It's a shorter book that goes back over the life of Jesus and includes some stories that maybe weren't told before. And so it's another account, and he says right in the beginning, and his argument is for really people who are logical. People who are logical, who weren't Jewish, who just want to come to, who believed other religions, and he comes to them and says there is no other God but Jesus. There is no other religion other than Christianity. And he makes that case going throughout that book. And so that's the one that's a little bit different, was written a little bit later, but was still written while most everybody was still alive. So after John, we see the book of Acts. Book of Acts is a continuation from the book of Luke, written by Luke as well. And basically, Luke continues on with the story. After Jesus dies and rises from death, what happens to the disciples? What do they do? People want to know, what did this group of people do? And so he goes through that story, starts telling the story of the early church and how it starts being created. And so the next group of books that we have is the epistles. The epistles are letters that were written by church leaders to individuals in the churches. These are letters that give further instruction. So there's not as much about the story of Jesus' life and death, but it's how to apply that. A lot of them take what happened in Jesus' life and connect it back to the Old Testament. They connect it to real world problems. We see churches that are really struggling. You see 1st and 2nd Corinthians were written to the church at Corinth. They were written to a church that was having a really hard time. And you see that with a lot of other things. You see the book of Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, written to a church leader by the name of Timothy that's really struggling, and he's needing some help from an older, more experienced pastor. And so as we go through all these books, we see these. Now, at the very end is the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation is technically one of these, but it goes a little bit further. It actually goes into the end times, talks about what comes in the future, and really sets up a stage where we see Jesus coming back in full authority. That we know that the story of Jesus is not over. It's still continuing on, and we know that because of the book of Revelation. So like I promised before, we're going to talk about the Apocrypha too. The Apocrypha is a collection of books that were added to the Catholic Bible at the Council of Trent in 1546. Now, if you are a Catholic, you might get a little upset with me, and I'm going to be honest here. That was when it was officially added. Now, how the Catholic Church treated the Apocrypha before then, they did accept it. They get very upset because they did, for all intents and practices, treat it as the Bible. The reason they, at the Council of Trent, really cemented it in was because they had this monk and priest who was really causing some trouble. His name was Martin Luther, and Martin Luther was causing some trouble. He was brought in at the he was an issue at the Council of Trent as well. He was trying to reform so if you hear about Reformation, the Reformation period, that was Martin Luther, about that 15 in the 1500s over in Germany. He was a monk and priest who really questioned the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so what he did was he read the Bible for himself, what we're telling you to do today, right here, right now. And he said, look, what the Catholic Church says is not the way I read the Bible. There's a couple things that I take issue with. He talked about grace. The Catholic Church was teaching that you have to work, that your salvation is based on what you do as well as God's grace. And he says, look, I read the Bible and I read that our salvation is only based on grace. It's only based on grace, that our works is our gratefulness. That's what we do in response. And so because of that and some other things that he believed, he really started to call out the Catholic Church on some of their teachings. So they had to take stronger stances on a lot of their teachings. And one of the things that they did was they made an official statement that the Apocrypha was going to be part of the Bible, because there's sections in the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is just 14 different books, pamphlets, kind of things that were added in to essentially that period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And so the Catholic Church added them really because they support some of the Catholic teachings that Protestants don't agree with, like purgatory. There's some talk about praying for the dead that they really push to be support for purgatory. And so that's some of the reason that they have the books. The early church leaders were really torn on these books. I'm not going to tell you that all of them were against them. They weren't. Here's what I would tell you about the Apocrypha. And we're not going to get into a huge debate on it. If you're looking to fight someone over it, look, I'm not the guy. Here's what I'm going to tell you. What I'm going to tell you is even the Catholic Church, who accepts the Apocrypha as Scripture, treats the rest of the Bible as the primary text. Okay? So you're not missing out if you don't have the Apocrypha. You're not missing out. The way I would look at the Apocrypha is I would look at it as Christian literature. Books that were written by people that weren't necessarily inspired. So when we look at and this is getting into why we see the books of the Bible as the books of the Bible, we believe that the authorship, so the author of the Bible, is dual. So we believe that God inspired the words and human authors wrote them down. That's what the Bible requires. God inspires authors to write for the purpose of it being put into the Bible. And so what we're saying is we question whether or not this is. Now, there's some reasons that I have why Protestants tend to reject these books, although the Catholic Church has added them into the Bible. So there's a couple different reasons why Protestants don't add these into the Bible, although the Catholic Church does. One, the authorship is questionable. We don't really know who wrote it. Now, there's other parts of the Bible where the authorship is slightly questionable, but for the most part, we generally have an idea as to who wrote it, right? And there's not any questions about the problem with the authorship of a lot of the Apocrypha is they actually borrowed other people's names to try to make the books more important, right? And so the authorship is questionable, and the books don't claim to be biblical text, okay? Nobody claims that until much later. They don't really claim that they are biblical text. They just tend to be accounts of what happened. And so the books are meant to be a lot of Christians believe, hey, look, it's okay if you want to read through through those books, that's great. But it's like going to Barnes and Noble and buying a Christian book, just a general Christian book. You kind of read it with that same concept that it doesn't have the authority of the full Bible. And I also want to talk about books that have been added after the book of Revelation. And so the question added is, books that were written after the book of Revelation, should those be included? Now, this is not a very common question. There are some books that did come out that claim to be written by certain people that were related to or connected with the original disciples of Jesus. Now, these books tend to have the same problems. One is a lot of the books were never preserved because nobody really considered them part of the Bible. People were very careful about keeping the Bible, protecting the Bible. We don't have as much of the actual text. A lot of these books, people have really speculated what they said because we don't have enough text to really know for sure. Second, they were written much later. The books that were written after Revelation, and people have debated about whether or not they should be added in. A lot of people today say it's the Catholic Church trying to keep extra books out of the Bible. That's just not the case. They were written much after, and here's a problem. So if I write, we saw this with, I think this will help you understand, we saw this a lot with Houdini. So there were not a lot of books written about Houdini while his family was still alive, because people were actually trying to lie about his life. Same thing about Jesus. People were trying to tell lies, but the problem is when all of the witnesses are still available. Yeah, let me back up real quick. Now, when it comes to, oh yeah, that feels good. So we're just going to back up. We're going to do it all over again here. Keep the truck going. So more recently, people have been asking questions also about books that were written after Revelation. Why have these books not been included with the Bible? And so I'm going to talk just real briefly about that because I don't want you to get too worried about it. There's a couple that were written the century following the life of Jesus. Now that's a problem. That's our first clue. They were written after all the witnesses to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus died. When everybody's gone, it's a lot easier to tell something that's not true. It's a lot easier to tell a lie because people can't check it out, you know. And we see that in the New Testament where there's an argument being made for Jesus, and the author says, "Look, Jesus appeared. He didn't just appear to me. He appeared before the 12. He appeared before a group of 500 different people, most of which they're all still alive. You can go talk to them. Go talk to the person who saw the guy who raised from death. He is a convincing witness. I will give you." And so that is a problem with these books that were written after. A lot of them were written way after. We have problems of authorship. We don't know who wrote the books. We have no idea. We know for a fact they weren't around Jesus. We know for a fact they weren't a witness to what happened. But they pretend to be other people. They use other people's names trying to get their own agenda across. They try to mislead people by using the names of people who were around when Jesus was. And that has been our long explanation, our quick explanation of what the Bible is, answering a couple questions that I often get about the Bible. If you have more questions, put them in the comments. Send me a message. Let me know. Do my best to get those questions answered. And we might even do another video. If we get enough of certain questions, we might do another video. This was only meant to be a huge overview. Like just up from, like you're up in an airplane and you're looking down and everything looks really small. Just a quick overview to give you a general idea as to what the Bible is.